Picture a medieval village in the middle of winter. The harvest was poor that year, the second poor harvest in a row. A child has been sick for 2 weeks, running a fever that won't break. The parents have prayed. The local priest has come and prayed with them. The fever remains. The child is getting weaker. The mother hasn't slept properly in days. And then someone in the village says, "Go find her." There's a woman who lives near the edge of the forest. Not quite in the village, but not quite outside it either. She knows plants. She knows fevers. She's helped half the village at one time or another with one ailment or another. And she has delivered 3 of the babies born this past year, 2 of whom would likely have died without her. She's not a healer in any official sense. She has no license, no title, no Latin, no formal education of any kind. She has something older and harder to categorize. Knowledge, accumulated over decades, passed down to her by the woman who raised her, who received it from the woman before that, in a transmission so old that no one alive can name where it began. The mother goes, the woman comes. She examines the child, makes a preparation from roots and bark she dried and stored in autumn, adjusts the bedding, gives careful instructions about what to do through the night. Within 3 days, the fever breaks. The child eats. The color returns. Now picture the same village, 2 winters later, a different family, a different child, a different illness. The woman is called again. She comes again. She does what she knows. This time, the child dies. The question that follows that death, the question of who is responsible, of where the fault lies, is the question that eventually destroyed thousands of women across Europe over 3 centuries. This is the history of the women the world called witches, and it is more complicated, more human, and more revealing than anything a fairy tale or a horror film has ever captured. Before the Malleus Maleficarum, before the trials, before the bonfires, there were women like the one in that village, in virtually every community across Europe and far beyond. Healers, herbalists, midwives, counselors, women who had developed, through years of practice and transmission, a working knowledge of the natural world that had no formal name but produced real results. They knew which plants reduced inflammation and which caused it. They understood something about the relationship between seasons, diet, and human health that the formal medicine of the era did not. They attended births, often in conditions of serious risk, and many of the techniques they used, positions, timing, interventions, were based on decades of observation that no university had codified. They prepared the dying for death and guided the grieving through what came after, in small communities, with no physicians for miles, and often no physicians anyone could afford regardless of distance. They were the functional medical system. Some of what they knew has since been confirmed. Certain plants, long described in traditional healing practice, have been found, through modern pharmacological research, to contain the precise compounds their practitioners claimed they contained. The willow bark preparations used for fever and pain contain salicylates, the compounds later synthesized into aspirin. Certain preparations used in midwifery have documented physiological effects. The antimicrobial properties attributed to honey and specific plant compounds were eventually verified in clinical settings. The women who carried this knowledge were not all right about everything. Pre-modern medicine is pre-modern medicine. But enough of what they knew was correct and effective, and demonstrably so, that communities returned to them generation after generation. You do not go back to someone who never helps you. These women were consulted because they produced results, but they were doing something else simultaneously, something that becomes important later. They were practicing a form of authority that required no institutional permission to exist. Their standing in the community came from direct demonstration, from relationship, from the fact that people had seen them work. That kind of authority cannot be revoked by a decree. It cannot be transferred by ordination. It exists because the community grants it based on evidence, and it persists as long as that evidence holds. Now hold that thought. We'll come back to it, because the story of what happened to these women is not a simple story of wisdom being hunted by ignorance. It is something more complicated, and to understand it honestly, you have to look at all of what was actually happening in medieval Europe. not just the part that's easiest to tell. The 14th and 15th centuries were periods of catastrophic instability across Europe. The Black Death had killed roughly a third of the population within a generation, moving through cities and villages with a speed and indiscrimination that no existing framework could explain. Crop failures came in sequences. Animal diseases swept through livestock without warning or cause that anyone could name. In a world without germ theory, without any understanding of nutrition or sanitation or microbiology, the gap between what people experienced and what they could explain was vast and terrifying. People watched children die of fevers that a week before had seemed minor. They watched entire harvests fail for reasons that seemed to have nothing to do with anything they had done or not done. They needed somewhere to put that. When suffering has no explanation, fear tends to find a vessel. It is a deeply human tendency, not unique to any culture or era. What was specific to late medieval Europe was the particular theological framework that was available to give that fear a name and a target. In 1486, two Dominican friars named Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger published the Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches. It would become one of the most circulated texts of the following century, printed dozens of times, carried by inquisitors in civil courts across the continent. The argument it made was systematic and explicit. Women, by virtue of characteristics the authors attributed to the female sex, were significantly more susceptible to diabolical influence than men. It provided detailed procedures for identifying, interrogating, and extracting confessions from accused witches. It converted fear into methodology. It gave communities under stress a procedurally respectable way to assign responsibility for disasters that had no natural explanation. The papal endorsement it claimed was disputed even at the time, and several theological faculties publicly refused to endorse the book. But it was already in circulation, already in use, and what it provided was exactly what frightened. Grieving communities needed a coherent answer to the question of why things kept going wrong, and a procedure for doing something about it. That answer was a woman. Here is where the history requires the most care, because the picture of the witch trials that exists in popular imagination, a systematic campaign to eliminate wise women and spiritual practitioners, is only part of the truth, and flattening the history into that single narrative does a disservice to the actual complexity of what happened, and to the real women who died in it. Many of the women executed in the trials were not herbalists, or midwives, or holders of unusual knowledge. They were simply women who were vulnerable in specific ways. Older women, often widows, who no longer had the social protection of a living husband. Women who were too poor, too isolated, or too lacking in powerful allies to defend themselves when an accusation came. Women caught in disputes with neighbors over property, over inheritance, over the kind of ordinary conflicts that in different circumstances would have been settled quietly. Women who were eccentric, difficult, too outspoken, or simply disliked by someone with more social influence than they had. Women who had the misfortune of living near a crop failure, or near a child who died of fever, or near a cow that stopped giving milk, and who had no one willing to stand up for them when blame needed somewhere to land. The confession extracted under torture, the signed statement that damned the woman who signed it, often had no connection to anything she had actually done. It was a document produced by a process designed to produce it, regardless of reality. Many of the accusers were neighbors. Many of the accusations were about resentment, about money, about the kinds of grievances that fester in small communities where everyone has watched everyone else struggle for years. The trials were not only about suppressing wisdom, they were also about fear needing a face, about communities under genuine and prolonged stress looking for a cause that was local and nameable and human, about legal and theological machinery that was, in practice, most efficiently applied to people who had the least capacity to resist it. Knowing all of this is necessary, because any account of this history that presents all the accused as mystical, practitioners being persecuted for their gifts, erases the reality of what many of them actually were. Ordinary women caught in machinery they had no part in creating and almost no power to stop. Honoring their memory requires telling their actual story, not a romanticized version of it. And yet the question of why women, specifically, became the primary target of that machinery is a question the history demands we answer seriously. Somewhere between 60 and 80% of those executed in the trials across Europe were women. That is not a coincidence. It is a pattern that requires an explanation. Part of the explanation is structural. Women occupied a particularly vulnerable position in medieval social and legal life, dependent on male protection, with limited, independent legal standing, with reputations far more fragile and more easily destroyed by accusation than men's incomparable positions. When a community needed to assign blame to someone, women were simply easier targets by the design of the society around them. But part of the explanation connects to something deeper, and it connects directly back to the woman at the edge of the forest. Because embedded within the figure of the dangerous witch, embedded within the specific way that accusation was framed and pursued, is an anxiety that goes beyond any individual crime. It is an anxiety about a particular kind of female authority. Knowledge that was not granted by any institution, competence that did not require any credential, trust that could not be revoked by any decree, and a relationship with the sacred that was direct, practical, and apparently functional, without any ordained intermediary involved. Think about what was happening in European society during this period, alongside the trials. The gradual consolidation of professional medicine into formally educated, institutionally certified male practitioners. The closing off of formal education to women. The systematization of religious authority into a clearly defined hierarchy in which women had no ordained role. The printing press beginning to centralize and standardize knowledge in ways that would make informal, oral transmission of practical wisdom seem backward by comparison. All of this was happening simultaneously. The figure of the witch emerged from that context, not as a simple reflection of reality, but as a construction, a way of naming and delegitimizing a category of female knowledge and female authority that had existed for centuries, but that was becoming increasingly incompatible with the institutional structures being built around it. The wise woman did not transform into the witch. The category of witch was built partly in order to transform the wise woman. Consider how the interpretive lens worked in practice. A woman helps a sick child recover. She is a healer. The same woman cannot help the next sick child. She becomes a suspect. The same knowledge, the same person, the same practice reads entirely differently depending on the outcome. Once a framework has been established that allows for suspicion, the Malias provided that framework, and it was catastrophically effective. It established the lens through which competence itself could become evidence of something sinister. The woman who knows plants too well, the woman who attends to many births, the woman who is too frequently present when illness visits a community, and too unexplainably effective when she is allowed to work. Under the framework the trials established, success itself could be suspicious, especially female success that operated outside of any institutional sanction. And notice what was happening in European society at exactly this same historical moment: the gradual consolidation of medicine into formally educated, institutionally certified male practitioners, the systematic exclusion of women from universities, the tightening of religious authority into a defined hierarchy in which women had no ordained role, the printing press beginning to centralize knowledge in ways that made oral, transmitted, practical wisdom seem backward by comparison, the slow emergence of the modern state with its preference for certifiable authority over community-granted credibility. These were not disconnected developments. They were part of a single large shift in how European culture organized and legitimized knowledge. And one of the casualties of that shift was the category of woman who knew things through ways that the new order could not certify or control. There is something in that observation that extends far beyond the medieval period and far beyond women as a specific category. The idea that access to the sacred must be authorized, that spiritual perception requires institutional validation before it can be taken seriously, that knowledge developed through direct experience and long attention is less legitimate than knowledge certified by the right organization, that wisdom carried in the body and passed through relationship is inferior to wisdom produced in formally approved settings. That set of ideas did not begin with the Malleus Malefic, but the trials helped crystallize it and inscribe it into the inherited culture of the West. They made legible, in the most violent possible way, the price of operating outside the officially approved relationship with the sacred. And that lesson was not lost on subsequent generations. This is where the story becomes about all of us, not just about the women who died in it. The women who were called witches, at their most authentic, were often simply women who paid deep attention to the body, to the plant, to the patient, to the season, to the person sitting across from them in pain. They had developed, through practice and inheritance, a quality of attunement to the world that produced useful knowledge and real results. Whether you frame that as empirical competence, or as spiritual sensitivity, or as something in between, the underlying reality is the same. These women had cultivated access to a form of understanding that their communities recognized and depended on, and they had done it without anyone's permission. That fact, perhaps more than any specific practice or belief, is what made them a problem for the systems that were consolidating power in late medieval Europe. Not the herbs, not the chants, or the preparations or the rituals. The underlying claim their very existence made, that knowing, that healing, that connecting with something larger than the self does not require institutional authorization to be real. The women who were called witches, the ones who were genuinely healers and practitioners and caretakers, were not practicing evil. They were paying attention. They were present to the world in a way that produced real results, and they trusted what that attention revealed, without waiting for anyone to tell them it was acceptable to trust it. That posture, whether we call it wisdom or spiritual sensitivity or simply deep attentiveness, is not a dark quality. It is one of the most essential human capacities there is. And it was precisely that capacity, in those women, that made them threatening to systems that required people to root their relationship with the sacred through approved channels. This is where history becomes something more than history. The idea that the sacred is accessible directly, without mediation by an appointed authority, is one of the most persistently unsettling ideas in human institutional history. Not because it is wrong, but because if it is right, enormous structures, built on the premise that access to God must be managed and dispensed and certified, become, at minimum, less necessary. Jesus himself, as recorded in the Gospels, makes statements that have unsettled religious institutions for 2,000 years. He says, in the Gospel of John, "I and the Father are one." He tells his followers that the kingdom of God is within you. He heals people consistently by restoring something in them, rather than depositing something from outside. He talks to fishermen and tax collectors and women at wells about the nature of God with the same directness he uses with religious scholars. His entire ministry suggests a God who is radically available, not rationed through hierarchical channels. And he says something else that speaks directly to this history. He tells his followers that they were made in the image of God, that something divine was placed in them at the origin of their being, not as a reward for correct behavior or institutional affiliation, but as the fundamental nature of what they are. The kingdom of God is within you is not a metaphor about heaven after death. It is a statement about the interior life of every human being alive right now. The women who were called witches, the ones who were healers and midwives and herbalists, the ones who paid deep attention to the natural world and to the human beings in their care, were in many cases practicing something that looks, from a certain angle, like a lived theology of that statement. They believed, at some level, that the world was alive with meaning, that the body had its own intelligence, that paying careful attention to what was actually present was a form of reverence, that healing was not a performance, but a restoration. That knowledge came through relationship as much as through instruction. They did not put it in those words. They probably did not think of it as theology at all, but the underlying posture, the radical attentiveness, the trust in what direct experience reveals, the refusal to wait for external permission to know what they knew, is recognizable as a spiritual practice in everything but name. That does not make all of them saints. It does not erase the complexity of the history, or pretend that every accusation was about suppressing ancient wisdom. The picture is messier than that. Many victims of the trials were simply vulnerable women caught in machinery they never created and had no power to stop. Their deaths were not mystical martyrdom. They were injustice, and the distinction matters. But the construction that made that machinery possible. The figure of the dangerous woman with unauthorized knowledge and unauthorized spiritual authority. That construction has a lineage and a logic that runs much longer than the trials themselves, and it is still running in subtler forms in contemporary life. The teaching that your own interior experience of God is less reliable than someone else's institutional interpretation of it. That spiritual sensitivity needs to be validated by external authority before it can be taken seriously. That the quiet knowing that comes through long attention to the natural world, to the body, to another person's pain, is not a legitimate form of perception unless it has been certified by the right source. That the direct relationship with the divine that Jesus described as already existing within every human being must be rooted through a particular set of approved intermediaries before it becomes real. That teaching has a history, and part of that history is in the villages of medieval Europe, where women who trusted their own knowing to visibly paid a price that most of us today can barely imagine. The fire went out centuries ago, but the doubt those centuries installed in human beings about the validity of their own interior experience has been slower to die. If what Jesus said is true, that we were made in the image of God, and that the kingdom of God is within us, then the most radical spiritual act available to any human being is to actually believe that. Not as a creed to recite, but as a lived reality. To trust that the sensitivity you carry, the intuition you sometimes dismiss, the moments of genuine connection you felt with something larger than yourself are not mistakes or wishful thinking. They are the interior life of a being made in the image of the divine, perceiving what that image was made to perceive. No one needs to wait for permission to be what they already are. That was true of the women at the edge of the forest. It is true of you. If this kind of reconnection, this return to a more direct and trusting relationship with the divine life already present in you, is something you've been circling. The ebook Reconnecting with Your Divine Essence was written for exactly this territory. Not as a system or a set of rules, as a companion for the interior journey back to what was placed in you before any institution ever decided whether to approve of it. The link is in the description. And the question that remains, when everything else in this video settles, the history of the women called witches is not only about what happened to them in the past, it is also about what was taught to all of us, about which parts of ourselves are safe to trust, which perceptions are acceptable, which connections to God are legitimate without needing to be certified, which forms of inner knowing are allowed. Maybe the real question this history leaves is not about those women at all. Maybe the question is this: what part of your own connection to God has been called dangerous, or strange, or too presumptuous, or simply unauthorized by voices that had their own reasons for wanting you to doubt it? And how long are you going to let that answer stand?